There's a version of history that doesn't appear in the history books. Not because historians don't know it, but because the people who lived through it, the ones who survived, had every reason to lie about it. And they were very, very good at lying. In the winter of 1476, a man died. The man who would inspire the legend of Dracula. The man whose name alone made grown soldiers weep. The man who ruled through terror so absolute that enemy armies would turn back rather than face his wrath. But here's the thing, and this is where the actual horror begins. Nobody actually knows how he died. We have the official story, the one that survived, the one carved into history books. Vlad the Impaler, they tell us, fell heroically in battle, slain by superior Ottoman forces. A soldier's death. Clean, meaningful, heroic. But what if that's not what happened? What if the real story is so disturbing, so treacherous, so psychologically devastating that the people involved literally erased it from history? What if the man who used fear as a weapon became its final victim? Today, we're going to untangle a conspiracy of silence that's lasted 550 years. We're going to look at the evidence that was hidden, the contradictions that were buried, and the three separate narratives that all somehow became one convenient lie. And what we find is far worse than the battles, far worse than the impalement, far worse than anything you've heard about Vlad the Impaler. This is the story they didn't want you to know. Before we talk about how Vlad died, we need to understand who he was. Not the legend, not the caricature, the actual man. Vlad III of Wallachia, born around 1428. A small kingdom nestled between the rising Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. The kind of place that should have been swallowed by history. The kind of place where princes died quietly, their names forgotten within a generation. But Vlad wasn't quiet. By the 1460s, he'd done something that seemed impossible. He'd created a military strategy so psychologically devastating that it didn't matter that his army was smaller. It didn't matter that he faced an enemy with vastly superior numbers. Because Vlad understood something that most rulers of his time didn't. That terror, real primal soul-crushing terror, could do what swords couldn't. His method was impalement. Thousands upon thousands of impaled corpses. He'd retreat from the Ottoman advance in 1462, leaving behind not just his army, but a message. A forest of stakes, each one topped with a dying or rotting human body. Thousands of them. Contemporary accounts speak of 23,000 impaled victims. Some historians say the number is inflated. But even if it was half that, even if it was a third, the psychological impact would have been unimaginable. Mehmed II, called the Conqueror, the man who had brought down Constantinople itself, the greatest city on earth, arrived at Vlad's retreat, expecting to crush him. Instead, he found himself staring at an ocean of corpses. Thousands of them arranged like a grotesque garden, many still alive, rotting in the sun. The Greek historian Chalkas was there. He documented it. He described how Mehmed's battle-hardened veterans, men who had seen the carnage of Constantinople's fall, were absolutely horrified. Some accounts suggest they refused to advance further. Some suggest Mehmed himself turned his army around. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the world, the man who had conquered the last great Byzantine stronghold, was psychologically broken by the sight of impaled corpses. He came to crush Vlad. He left traumatized. But here's where the story gets twisted. Because Mehmed couldn't just leave it at that. He couldn't allow the world to see that he'd been psychologically defeated by a provincial prince. He couldn't allow his enemies, and he had many, to know that he'd been broken. So he did what empires do. He waited. He plotted. And he made sure that when Vlad finally fell, the story would be one of Ottoman might, of imperial superiority, of a victorious conqueror crushing an enemy. The narrative had to be controlled. You're watching this because you can smell the lie, and that instinct. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. Because what comes next is where the real conspiracy unfolds, where we expose who benefited from burying the truth. Let's talk about propaganda, because that's really what this is. After the horror of 1462, Mehmed couldn't kill Vlad directly. Vlad had supporters. Hungary, at least its king, had a vested interest in Vlad. A direct assassination would have been messy, it would have created questions, and it would have given Vlad's allies a reason to rally around his memory. So instead, Mehmed withdrew. He let Vlad's own enemies do the work. And Vlad had plenty of enemies. His own brother, Radu, was in Ottoman service. The Wallachian boyars, nobles, had been brutalized by Vlad's reign of terror. They'd seen their power stripped away, their lands confiscated, and their families destroyed. Many of them had reason to hate him. Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, supposedly Vlad's Christian ally, had his own ambitions for Wallachia. He didn't want a powerful, independent Vlad. He wanted a puppet. He wanted control. So when Vlad, desperate and isolated, fled to Hungary after being overthrown, Matthias made a decision. He arrested him. He locked Vlad away for 13 years. 13 years. Vlad went from being the terror of the Ottoman Empire to a powerless prisoner. And to justify this, to explain to the Pope and Christian Europe why he was imprisoning a supposed hero, Matthias's court fabricated documents. Letters allegedly from Vlad offering his allegiance to Sultan Mehmed, calling him a traitor to Christendom. Modern historians almost universally agree these letters were forgeries. But the damage was done. Vlad's reputation, his legend, his status as a Christian hero was destroyed. He went from being the Impaler, the scourge of the Ottomans, to a traitor who had collaborated with the Sultan. And he sat in prison while the world forgot about him. 13 years. Think about what that would do to a man. The psychological toll, the isolation, the knowledge that everyone you fought for had abandoned you, that your allies are your jailers, that the legend you built is being rewritten by your enemies. But then something changed. Around 1475, it became politically useful for Matthias to release Vlad. The Ottoman threat was growing again. Perhaps Matthias thought he could use Vlad as a pawn in his own games against the Ottomans. Or perhaps Matthias just calculated that Vlad, broken and weakened after 13 years in captivity, would be easier to control than the fierce warrior he'd once been. Either way, Vlad was released. He was sent back to Wallachia to reclaim his throne. Now, this is where the timeline becomes crucial. This is where we begin to see the cracks in the official narrative. Because what happened next happened fast. Vlad did indeed reclaim his throne, but it only lasted for 2 months. Less than 2 months after 13 years in captivity. And in those 2 months, something happened that killed him. The official story claims he died in a battle, a glorious last stand against the Ottoman forces, a heroic death fighting the ancient enemy. But there are problems with this story. Big problems. First, the timeline doesn't add up. Contemporary sources give conflicting accounts of when he died. Some say December 1476. Others say January 1477. Some sources are so vague that we can't pin down an exact date within weeks of each other. Second, the location is disputed. Where did he die? Which battle did he die in? Which Ottoman general was involved? The accounts are so inconsistent that historians still argue about the basic geography of his death. Third, and here's where it gets disturbing, there are multiple theories about what actually killed him, and they all contradict the official narrative. Let me lay them out for you. Vlad was leading a small force against Ottoman positions when a larger Ottoman army ambushed him. He was overwhelmed, killed in combat, and his head was sent to Constantinople as a trophy. This story benefits everyone. It makes Mehmed look powerful. Matthias looked like he sent a brave man to a brave death, and gives Vlad a heroic ending. But there's a problem. The details don't hold up. If this was such a significant Ottoman victory, why isn't it documented in Ottoman records as such? Mehmed was obsessive about documenting his military successes. Yet the records from Ottoman historians about Vlad's death are remarkably sparse. This opens the door to something darker. In the chaos of battle, Vlad, armored and fighting desperately, was mistaken for an Ottoman soldier by his own men and killed by them. Imagine the desperation in that moment. Vlad, leading a small, outnumbered force in winter, in the dark, with the battle raging around him. He's fighting hand to hand, lost in the confusion. A panicked soldier, maybe a young recruit or someone desperate to survive, thrusts a spear through him. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, it's too late. Vlad is already dead. His own men killed him. And then what? If this is the truth, Vlad's supporters have every reason to hide it. It would be shameful. It would be disastrous for Matthias, who sent Vlad back to reclaim his throne. It would be an embarrassment to the legendary figure he was. Much better to create a story about a glorious battle, a brave death, a heroic stand against the Ottomans. This leads us to a more disturbing possibility. Vlad had just reclaimed his throne. He had been absent for 13 years, and the nobles who controlled Wallachia, the boyars, had become comfortable in their power. They liked their positions. They didn't want the old terror back. Moreover, there were Ottoman agents in Wallachia. Vlad's brother Radu was still alive and had supporters. What if Vlad was assassinated, not in battle, not by accident, but deliberately, through a conspiracy? It could have been the boyars, the same families who had assassinated his father and killed his brother, those who had a long history of removing rulers who became too powerful. Or it could have been Ottoman agents, maintaining the fiction of a battle while actually murdering him. If this were the case, it would need to be covered up. The truth couldn't come out. It would expose the boyar regicides and show that Vlad, despite his power, couldn't protect himself. It would also show that Matthias's grand plan to use Vlad as a pawn had completely failed. Much easier to say he died in battle. Here's something that should disturb you. Vlad was a man of immense symbolic importance. Whether a hero or villain, he was legendary. His name struck fear into the Ottomans. When he died, no matter how he died, you would expect his body to matter. You'd expect it to be found, documented, and either buried with honor or displayed as a trophy. But instead, Vlad's corpse vanishes. His head was sent to Constantinople. Yes, but his body? The monastery at Snagov, near Bucharest, is traditionally believed to be his burial place. It was excavated in the 1930s. The archaeologists found a grave marked for Vlad. It was empty. More precisely, it contained only animal bones. This is where the conspiracy becomes undeniable. Someone deliberately removed his body. Someone made sure his grave was empty. Someone erased the final evidence. Why would you do that? If Vlad died a heroic death in battle, why hide his body? Why not display it or give him a proper burial, then publicize it? The only reason to hide a body is if the circumstances of its death are too disturbing to reveal. But wait, there's more. A different discovery was made at the Kana Monastery, a site that Vlad himself had founded, much closer to where the supposed battle took place. In the 1950s, archaeologists discovered a headless corpse in a grave, a male skeleton dated to the right period. Could this be Vlad? It's possible. It would make sense. He died in battle, his head sent to Constantinople, and his body buried at Kamana, a place meaningful to him. But here's the thing, it's not certain. The skeleton was never definitively identified. The remains were never conclusively proven to be Vlad's. And that's strange, isn't it? If historians truly believed Vlad was buried there, wouldn't they have conducted DNA analysis? Wouldn't they have verified the bones, confirmed the legend? Instead, there's ambiguity. There's uncertainty. A headless corpse that might be Vlad, or it might not be. This raises a question. What if the body at Kamana isn't Vlad at all? What if it was placed there deliberately to serve as a cover story? What if the real Vlad, the true evidence of his death, remains hidden? The more we look at the physical evidence, the more the official story falls apart. So let's do something important here. Let's examine who had the power to bury the truth and what each of them stood to gain from the official narrative. For the Ottoman Sultan, the narrative was perfect. Vlad, the man who had psychologically broken him, the provincial prince who had humiliated him in front of his army, was finally dead. And more importantly, Mehmed killed him. The reality might have been more complicated. The death might have been Messier, or Vlad might have been killed by his own men or assassinated in a chaotic battle. But the simple story, Mehmed's victory over Vlad, served Ottoman interests perfectly. It made the empire look dominant. It showed that defiance was futile, that even a man as terrifying as Vlad Dracula couldn't escape the reach of the Ottoman military. This narrative needed to be protected. For the king of Hungary, Matthias, the calculus was different, but equally important. Matthias had imprisoned Vlad for 13 years. He'd held a Christian hero captive while claiming to fight the Ottomans. That was a PR disaster waiting to happen. When he finally released Vlad, sending him to reclaim his throne, Matthias was playing a dangerous political game. He was betting that Vlad would succeed, that he would become loyal to Hungarian interests. But instead, Vlad died almost immediately. If the truth was that Vlad died in a chaotic, poorly supported military operation, that Matthias essentially sent him to his death, it would have been a disaster. It would raise questions about Matthias's judgment and make him look like he had betrayed Vlad twice. Once by imprisoning him, and once by sending him to his death. But if the story was that Vlad died heroically fighting the Ottomans, defending Christendom, Matthias could position himself as the man who freed a great warrior to fight for the Christian cause. It was a redemption narrative, and it required that the truth stay buried. As for the nobles of Wallachia, the boyars, these were the families who had assassinated Vlad's father, who had killed his brother Radu, and who had grown comfortable with their power during Vlad's 13-year absence. They had every reason to want Vlad dead. They didn't want the terror returning. They didn't want their power stripped away again. They didn't want their families brutalized. If Vlad was assassinated by a conspiracy of boyars, if it was a targeted killing to prevent him from consolidating power, then those families would be guilty of regicide. They would be oath breakers, deserving of punishment. But if Vlad died in a glorious battle against the Ottomans, then the boyars weren't assassins. They were simply nobles in a kingdom facing external threats. The lie protected them from justice. And finally, the records we have come from all of these interested parties, the Ottomans, the Hungarians, the boyars, all of them had reasons to craft a particular narrative about Vlad's death. They wanted a story that would serve their own needs, and over time, that story became the truth. But the more we dig, the clearer it becomes that what we've been told is not the full picture. Vlad's death is shrouded in mystery, and the real truth, the one that threatens to undo the legends and the lies, has been buried for centuries. But as the pieces of the story fall into place, we begin to realize that the official narrative is just that, a narrative. A carefully crafted lie, shaped by those who needed it to be true. Ottoman histories, Hungarian records, and Wallachian accounts, most were written by people who weren't even there. No one was documenting the truth. Instead, they were documenting versions of the truth that served their interests. And because everyone benefited from the same lie, that Vlad died heroically in battle against the Ottoman forces, that became the story that survived. It's a conspiracy, but not in the usual sense. No secret meetings, no formal agreements. Instead, it's a conspiracy of silence, a mutual understanding among all parties that the simple story served everyone's interests better than the messy truth. The Ottoman Sultan got a victory. The Hungarian king got redemption. The Wallachian nobles avoided being called assassins. And Vlad got to be remembered as a hero, rather than a victim of treachery and court intrigue. Everyone benefited. Everyone, except the truth. But here's what's truly disturbing about this story. It's not just about Vlad. It's not just a 15th century mystery. It's about how power works, how the powerful control the narrative, how the truth dies not with a bang, but through a collective decision to look away. Vlad the Impaler built his empire on psychological terror. He understood that fear was more powerful than swords. He knew the mind was the real battlefield. And that strategy worked. It made him legendary. It made him feared. It made him dangerous. But here's the irony. The very principle of controlling perception and manipulating the narrative, which Vlad used to dominate his enemies, was ultimately used against him. The people around him understood something. To truly defeat Vlad, they couldn't just kill his body. They had to kill his story. They had to transform his death from a messy, treacherous, possibly humiliating end into a heroic myth. They had to erase the evidence of how he really died. They had to make sure that for 550 years, the world would believe a comfortable lie instead of an uncomfortable truth. And they succeeded. Think about it. Vlad the Impaler, the man who conquered through fear, became a victim of the very psychological tactics he once wielded. He became a cautionary tale about the limits of power. No matter how terrifying you are, no matter how absolute your control seems, there are always forces stronger than you. There are always people willing to lie about what happened to you. There are always forces rewriting your story after you're gone. The ultimate cruelty isn't the impalement. It isn't the torture. It isn't even the death itself. It's being erased. It's having your story rewritten by your enemies. It's becoming a puppet in someone else's narrative. That's what happened to Vlad. That's the real horror. So, here's what I want to know from you in the comments. We have these clean versions of history. Heroic myths about how great figures died, how important battles were won, how empires rose and fell. But what if a lot of it is wrong? What if the real history, the messy, complicated, and disturbing history, is buried under these comfortable narratives? What other historical figures do you think might have a completely different story? What other heroic deaths might actually have been assassinations? What other glorious battles might actually have been chaotic tragedies? And here's the bigger question. If the victors always get to write the history, how much of what we believe about the past is actually true? And how much is just the lie that the powerful needed us to believe? Drop your theories in the comments. Let's dig into these forgotten truths together. If you want more disturbing history, more stories the mainstream once buried, then hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we're going deeper into the parts of history that make you question everything you thought you knew. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one. The man who ruled through terror became a victim of the most subtle terror of all, the eraser of truth. And 550 years later, we're still seeing the ripples of that lie.